my screen. I need to make myself the presenter. Share my screen. Make presenter. Yes.
I see your face.
Are you able to see my screen?
I saw
yes,
you.
I go.
You saw me.
Yeah.
I saw your face there for just a second.
Yeah. But your screen
There's
card
so much-
has not come up yet. I mean, I see.
There we go. Yeah, sorry.
I've got it.
Well, sorry about that, guys. There was an extra computer in the conference room that's logged in as me, and I had it set to the wrong one. So welcome everybody for the little bit of a hiccup there to the local agency Traffic Safety Academy. Everyone that's here received the email with the login information. There's a few important emails and links on the email that you received. You've got Dennis's email here if you have any questions. He'll introduce himself in a minute. You've got my email here if you have any technical issues accessing the webinar or getting any of the materials that we post. There is a site here as well to the TampaBayTrafficSafety.com page. If we click on that, it takes you to our webpage. You have information about the upcoming webinars and the ones that we've completed for this, I guess, 2017 semester or sessions. Down a little bit below that, we have the presentations and the recordings for the past webinars. If there is a topic that you're interested in seeing that you were not able to attend, down at the bottom, we also have resources where we have our professional development hours request forms. So you can download those and fill out the information if you're a professional engineer seeking professional development hours. With that, I'll hand it over to Dennis for the introduction on the Academy.
Okay, can you see my screen, Anthony?
It's coming up. Yes.
Okay. Before I begin the little slideshow that I usually go through every day or every webinar for the introduction, first I want to mention to you that this is our 5th Safety Academy webinar for 2017. And today's safety webinar topic is Florida Design Manual New Fdot Standards Complete Streets by Dwayne Carver, who is an AICP member, and his title is a State Complete Streets Program Manager, and he works for FDOT headquarters in Tallahassee in the Roadway Design Office. And with that, I'm going to kind of go into our introduction, and I want to mention to everybody, as usual, that this series of webinars are to provide information on safety-related issues to enhance your local safety program. This is the 5th year of the District 7 Safety Academy. It's scheduled usually from 10 to 12 o'clock, and it's a 2-hour window. And it's a minimum of 1 hour, but no more than 2 hours. And the length of each webinar is dependent upon the complexity of the topic and questions might be asked. Anthony's mentioned about these 2 links I have on the screen. One is about registering, and that's in your notice, or you go out to the link below it, and that will also bring up the registration. Now, on the workshop series, as I mentioned today, is Florida Design Manual New Fdot Standards Complete Streets. But I want to bring to your attention that we're on May 24th, but the ones that are highlighted on the column, on the dates, on July 12th is a brand new topic. We've added 4 topics. Key messages for pedestrians, bicyclists, and drivers on July 12th. October 4th, we've got pedestrian intersection lighting retrofit. And November 1st, lane departure initiative. And on the 13th of December, which we had to be announced, is ICE as intersection control evaluation. I will further mention that we have another topic that will be added soon, and will either be August 30th or September 6th, and it will be on the Arrive Alive FHP-based RSAs. So I just look forward to that. And just remember, when you register, you automatically will get a notice for these webinars, and you attend the ones that you can. So I'm just putting on notifications about the new ones we added. So there'll be a total of 16 as of today. I also want to mention on the Safety Academy News that these sessions are submitted for AICP credit. We went through a process here last month, and we had to do some updating because it seems that some of the webinars in the past were not properly posted, but all of 2016 are out there, and the first 4 of 2017 are out there. The 5th one will be out there soon, and then today's will be out there for those that are AICP members. And also remember, you can check out the link that I think Anthony has posted that you can give you the steps. If you're a member, you should know how to look this up, though. Also, if you are a professional engineer and you need your PDH for credits, then this is the information related to that. It gets sent to Larry Hagan. This information also is out on the website, and the form can be downloaded and you can submit that to get your certification. And then this is my contact information if you need any assistance and you have any questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dwayne, and thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint here. Are you all seeing my screen?
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you for the chance to come back and present at the Safety Academy. I've done this a few times, and I always enjoy doing it and hearing from folks who are trying to make the state safer. And like the chance to talk to you about what FDOT is doing with our Complete Streets program and the new FDOT design manual. So I wanted to go over that with you today. If you have questions, just type them in the box there. They'll be monitoring those questions for me, and I'm going to ask my organizers if you see something that you think you need to break in and ask me about, if there's a point of clarification or maybe I misspoke something, use your judgment about doing that. That's fine. For other questions, though, I'll try to go through the slides fairly quickly, and if there's anything I haven't covered, then we can take questions at the end, and be glad to do it that way. But if you see something that you need to break in and ask me a question about, please do. I'll trust your judgment on that. Okay. In 2014, the Department of Transportation adopted a Complete Streets policy, and that policy was really directly safety related. It came out of earlier, I think the 2012 Dangerous by Design report came out listing Florida as one of the least safe places in the country to walk or bicycle. And the Department of Transportation Secretary at the time, Ananth Prasad, was very troubled by this. He brought in Billy Hadaway, who a former DOT engineer, as the District 1 Secretary, and made him the bicycle and pedestrian safety champion, and basically said we need to change what we do at the department to fix this problem as best as we can at the Department of Transportation, and gave Billy quite a big stick to go around and make changes as he saw fit. He made a number of changes institutionally, and one of the things of many that we did was to adopt a Complete Streets policy to try to change the way the department looks at how we design and plan and build roadways. So the policy was adopted in September 2014, and it has all the good feel-good language that you would expect there about safety, quality of life, and economic development, recognizing that the Department of Transportation is an economic development agency. The things that we do have an effect on how well communities can develop. It also introduced this language of context-sensitive system of complete streets. And so that's when we first start talking about the idea that when DOT says complete streets, you need to think context. Context is really the name of the game here. We also pointed out specifically in the policy that we'll be serving the needs of all our transportation system users, including the ones we normally expect, cyclists and pedestrians, but also freight handlers, motorists, and pedestrians and other folks and transit users. So the department recognized that on our system, we do, as part of the state highway system, have to serve a wide range of users. So we can't really afford to say we're going to optimize something for one set of users and just let the others figure it out. Whatever we do, it has to be balanced. We have to have a balanced approach to this, and the policy recognized that from the beginning. The department also recognized that all around the state of Florida, there are communities that are adopting complete streets ordinances and policies of various kinds. And this was beginning to be sort of an issue for us, because if we came to your town and you had one of these policies and maybe you wanted to apply it for a state road, it could be done, but it couldn't be done easily. It probably would require some variations or exceptions, a lot of things that, you know, we try to stay away from sometimes. It's okay to do those things, but do you have to, should you always have to do a variation or exception to do something that maybe is the right thing to do? So that began to help us understand that maybe the department needs to go back and look at what our standards were and our criteria were, and make sure that we're keeping track with how things are going in the 21st century. So this was already having a lot of communities in Florida, and so we wanted to make sure that the Department of Transportation could work effectively in all the parts of Florida and all the cities and counties where we work. We worked with Smart Growth America to come up with an implementation plan. We had a great policy, we thought, but what do you do with the policy? How do you actually make it work? DOT is a big agency. We've been around for over 100 years now. How do we change what we're doing and turn the ship around a little bit, so to speak, or at least change course a bit? So we completed the implementation plan in December 2015, and it was basically a chapter and verse description of how to go through and enact our complete streets policy. And what they did for that plan was they went through and looked at all the different documents and design guidance and everything that the department does, and identified about a dozen of those that were really important to change, and then they would cause everything else to change. It also does provide a common vision for what we mean by complete streets within the Department of Transportation. Smart Growth also helped folks understand at DOT that complete streets requires a multidisciplinary approach. It's not just something you can do in planning. It's not just something you can do in design or traffic engineering. It really takes everybody to be engaged in the solutions to make these things work. And they also helped us understand that complete streets is a process and it's not a product. And one of the most common questions that I get is, we have this thing and we want it to be a complete streets project. Well, all projects are now complete streets projects. Complete streets is the way that we do things, the way we look at how a project is put together, how we determine where the context is for that project, and then we determine what criteria go into that. If we do those things properly, then the end product is a complete street. So basically everything we do ends up becoming complete streets. It's a process that we go through. It's not necessarily a product that we have. Here's our implementation plan that we put together about a year ago for figuring out, okay, we had the plan here. How do we take this plan? As I said, it had about a dozen or so documents that had specific things that needed to be changed. Up here is it used to be the plans preparation manual. We decided that it needed to be overhauled quite a bit, so we're actually sunsetting the plans preparation manual. We'll have a completely new Fdot design manual. We'll talk about that today. Down here, and you can download this off our website at flcompletestreets.com if you want to have a copy that may be more readable than what we're looking at here. Down here, these blue documents are all the other documents that were identified in the implementation plan that needed to be changed, and you can see we have timelines here for when these need to be changed and how they need to be updated along the way. The red box is showing where we are today, and essentially we've got the design manual out for review right now. The Complete Streets Handbook is out for external review right now, and we're anticipating having that done in June. In fact, this is a better look at what the schedule will look like. So the draft of the handbook came out in April. We also released a draft of the FDM at that point. We're accepting comments through May 26th on the handbook, and then we need to compile those and try to get a final draft of the Complete Streets Handbook out in June and get that finalized. And then in November 2018, on November 2017, we'll actually have a posting of the FDM, and then the FDM becomes effective on January 2018. The FDM, of course, is the Fdot Design Manual. When I say FDM, that's the acronym I'm talking about. So I want to talk first about the Complete Streets Handbook. The handbook and the FDM kind of work together. I'm going to start with the handbook, and then we'll kind of work into the FDM. The handbook introduces the concept of context classifications, and DOT has a new way of looking at where we are in space, and that will affect how we design projects, and we call this context classification. And it also talks about in the handbook how we add this concept of context classification to project scoping as we're working on our projects. The handbook talks about the role that local governments play in this, and they do play a role in this, and it discusses what the department's going to do as our part of this as well. The handbook is not a design manual. We have the Fdot design manual, It's also not a best practices book. We talked for a long time about what should go into this handbook and how it should be put together and what should be in it. And we decided that there are a lot of really good guidance out there already on how to design for complete streets. And there's a lot of good guidance on how to plan and put those things together as well. The DOT did not necessarily need to regurgitate that. So in our handbook, what we've tried to do is really just focus on the things that are either different than what we've done in the past, or the things that were very specific to what DOT was going to do. And then also letting local governments and our local partners know, okay, we're changing this, and that means you need to be aware of it because it might change the way you do that. So those are all things that are in the handbook, and we do not have a lot of extra material in there about best practices or design guidance. That will be in the FDM. So we talk about what to expect from DOT, what's expected from our local partners under partnership and agency collaboration. This executive summary at the front end here is actually designed, if you wanted to, you could just print out these 6 pages and have them as a standalone to sort of explain what's going on with the rest of the document, and you can dig into it more deeply as you want to do that. So as people are getting their heads around what's in the handbook, that's a good place to start. We provide guidance on context classification. That's the only place right now that this is found. It's found in the handbook. We don't have it really listed anywhere else. And it does point you back to the design manual for the criteria that you actually would use to design our roadways. One thing we want to make very clear is there's no new funding for Complete Streets. This is not a funding program. It's a philosophy and an approach to designing projects. So there's not a Complete Streets pot of money out there anywhere that you can go and tap into. Really, all of our pots of money, if you want to look at it that way, are Complete Streets pots of money from that perspective. So whatever funding we use today to fund roadways and projects, that's the way we're still doing it in the future under Complete Streets. The only difference is in the future, they will be considering this context classification, which we haven't done in the past. And I'll talk more about what that means. We also have an increased emphasis on partnerships and assembling funding packages. And I want to talk a little bit more about what that means exactly. So local governments program projects through their LRTP to support Complete Streets. So when you want to talk about a system that is context-based, that provides for all of your users, that's what the department is trying to move toward on our roadway system. There are a lot of things on our roadway system today that we can't always do. We get design exceptions and variations for various things that happen based on the funding that's available and based on the types of pots the money's coming out of. So what we find is if there's things especially that local governments would like to have on a state project that we wouldn't normally provide as part of our criteria, those can be funded, and this is not any different than what we're doing today. Those things can be funded by the local governments through their LRTP, for instance, or their work program to support that. MPOs can prioritize projects that they think are going to be more supportive of Complete Streets, and so that's another avenue that you can have there. Any new capacity projects that the department builds, or automatically those will be context-based, and so to the extent that that we can make those Complete Streets projects using our criteria, they will be there with that. So, but that will depend a lot on what the context is, and you'll see some contexts are, for instance, more friendly toward pedestrians and other users than others are. We'll talk about that in just a minute. One thing that's not changed is that enhancements beyond what the DOT standards require today will still require local funding participation. Some examples of this, decorative lighting. We have new standards for pedestrian lighting. So that's in our standards today. We'll make sure that those are provided. If you need a particular type of lighting to match your downtown development theme or whatever, that's all perfectly fine and legitimate, but we're not going to pay the extra cost for that lighting, and that's not a change from the way we do that today. If you want decorative paving on the roadway, we have mechanisms in place today to fund that, and that's still there, and the locals are responsible for that. Enhanced landscaping, and any other items that vary from what our criteria and standards require today, the locals will still be responsible for participating in the funding for that. So that's why you need to understand what's in the FDM in order to really understand what the department will be able to bring to the table for you. I'll go over some of that today. So the heart of all this context-based design is the concept of context. So how do you know where you are in space? And so we have a context classification system that we use at the department to do that. So this puts the context in the term context-based design. If you're familiar with the transect system that's been used in land development and city planning practice for a number of years now, this is very similar to that. You're not going to have any issues making a translation to that. it allows the department to have fine-tuned designs that go beyond just urban and rural, and I'll show you what that means when we get into the FDM criteria in just a moment. So instead of just saying it's either urban or rural, we now actually have 8 different categories of types of land development patterns and transportation contexts that we can design around. And this allows us to be much more specific about the types of projects and types of criteria we can use. So things like the appropriate design speed were very difficult to determine in the past. If all we had was urban, in the past, urban could include a wide range of stuff, and in the current system, though, we can break it down more closely. So the way the context classification system will work is if you're going more rural, down toward this end at C1, and if you're going more urban, you're up toward this end at C6. Very quickly, C6 is the most urban condition you can imagine. Those are cities of 1 million population or more. It's your downtown Tampa, downtown Orlando, downtown Miami, those kinds of places. C5 is your urban center, your downtown. Most cities in Florida have a C5 location. It might be downtown Bradenton, downtown Gainesville, downtown Tallahassee. Those areas are your C5. Your C4 is your urban general category. That's your general fabric of your city. Suburban, we actually cut into 2 different categories. There's a more commercially oriented C3C suburban and a C3R suburban residential. I'm going to skip over rural town for just a moment. Rural lands are lands that are not developed today, but they could be in the future. A lot of times those are in agricultural use. And C1 are lands that are not developed and will never be developed. They're set aside as state parks or national forests or something like this, and there are areas that will not be developed for various reasons. In between, we have this thing called rural town, and if you're more familiar with the transect system, this doesn't exist on the transect. This was something that we put together based on more on conditions in Florida. We have a lot of situations in Florida. We have these small historic towns that are surrounded by large rural areas, and we recognize that those don't really qualify as urban centers. They really don't even qualify as urban general because they're not part of a city. They're out in the middle of the country, although their characteristics may be similar to parts of urban general. So they actually have their own category, a C2T rural town, and that allows the department to recognize as we're designing for and planning for an area, if we come to one of these small towns, that we can treat that a little differently now. In the past, we kind of had to put our blinders on and say, well, it looks like a highway to me. We're just going to run right through. Now we have the ability to back off a little bit and say, oh, this is a rural town. We have different design criteria for rural town, so we can work on a different approach to meeting the needs and the transportation needs of this area. So that's how the context classification system works, and I'm glad to take questions on that at the end if you have any. We have the handbook out right now for review, and you can go to flcompletestreets.com and download it if you haven't yet. The comment period closes May 26th, and we'd like you to take this survey if you don't mind. That's the best way for us to compile all the comments and questions and understand how people are receiving this handbook, so I encourage you to do that if you haven't done that yet. Okay, moving into the Fdot design manual. The handbook had all the language about context classification, and that's all great, but what does it mean? How does it going to change the criteria that we have? So we took the old PPM, if you're familiar with that, that will be gone at the end of this year. Basically, we printed the last one of those, and the new manual will be the Fdot design manual. It has, the old PPM had 2 volumes. This has 3 parts, a 100 series, which is the processes, a 200 series, which is our criteria, and a 300 series, which is what goes into plans production. So I'm just going to touch mostly on criteria today, which is the 200 series. And there's a complete other presentation that the other folks in the criteria section here in Roadway Design Office can do for you if you're interested on what exactly is going in and what changes are being made to the FDM. I just have a few slides out of that to share with you today, though. Here are the highlights. It is a replacement for the PPM. The criteria are actually in the FDM. They're not in the Complete Streets Handbook, and this is one thing we keep reiterating with people. The handbook does not have criteria in it. Those criteria are in the FDM. The FDM does introduce context classification to determine the design criteria. That's a change from what's been in the past. And that first draft is also, the FDM is also ready for you to review at flcompletestreets.com. You can go there and the links will take you to the FDM. You can download that and review it as well. So in terms of what's changing, under the PPM, the design criteria were based on functional classification, the project area, and the design speed. Those are really the things that figured out what your design criteria were going to be. Some of this has changed, some of it has not changed. Functional classification has not changed. So if you were an arterial, collector, whatever you were in the past, that really doesn't change. We still recognize those, we just don't use them as much for criteria anymore. But they're still there. A lot of people were concerned about leaving those functional classifications in place. Sometimes they affect your funding eligibility for different types of programs. There's different reasons that you need that functional class there. Functional class is a good planning tool, so that's not changing. That's all still there. We just don't base our criteria on it anymore, at least not as much as they used to. What's really changed the most is this context classification, which now replaces the project area type. So whereas we used to just have urban and rural, now we have those 8 different context classification types. And now that we have more specific context classification, our design speeds actually also can change. And so we can have lower design speeds in certain context classifications. I'll show you what that looks like. So this is comparing the allowable design speed range under the Plans Preparation Manual and under the FDM. And I'm going to ask you to ignore for just a moment this column over here for SIS. I'll come back to that. But this column in the middle is our arterial design speed ranges. And so under the PPM, you can see the range essentially changed here. You were either rural or you were urban. And urban got you, 40 to 60 miles an hour. That was your design speed range, no matter where in the urban area you were. So if you're on the edge of town in the suburbs, you get 40 to 60. If you're in the urban core, we're supposed to be designing for 40 to 60 miles an hour under the Plans Preparation Manual. That was the old way of doing things. This is kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. The new approach under the FDM, as you can see here, depending on where you are in space on these context classifications, the design speed changes quite a bit down here in the rural section, or in the urban sections of it. Notice that above this red line, not too much changes. So if you're in the rural or natural areas, as far as FDOT is concerned, our roadways in those areas are basically high-speed roads, and so our design criteria don't really change in those locations. But this new rural town category, we actually have a lot more flexibility there in the urban general, really all of these, but it's particularly in the C5 and C6, you can see you have quite a bit of new flexibility for lower design speeds in these areas. So this will allow us to put what Secretary Boxall would like to call the right street in the right place. So this lets us match these up more carefully. Now, going back to the SIS for just a moment, the SIS is designed for high-speed travel. It's designed for high freight movement, and so the criteria for that are a little different than they are for arterial roadways. But even on the SIS, the department recognized that in these most urban conditions, we didn't need to be trying to shove traffic through at 65 miles an hour. If you need to move traffic through at 65 miles an hour, maybe you're looking at a limited access facility. And limited access facilities will be designed the same way they always have been. They don't really change that much based on context. This is for at-grade arterials. And so if you have an SIS facility in these context areas, it also has a different minimum design speed than it used to have in the past. So even the SIS has adapted to some extent to these new context classifications. The FDM increases flexibility in design. As you can see, we have a range now of different design speeds we can use, whereas instead we're always trying to build for the highest or for the fastest roadway that we could. We now may be designing for a slower roadway. So we have, when your speeds go down, you get a lot more flexibility in what you can have in your design elements. And this also allows local partners to do more on their part because they're also not trying to optimize the speed. And when the speeds come down, we have a lot more flexibility about what can happen on the roadside. For instance, we can adjust the lane width, we can adjust median widths, we can change the lateral offsets. Those are actually all reduced under the lower speed conditions in the FDM. On the other hand, in these more urban conditions, we can have a wider border width so that we can have wider sidewalks. So those are some things that have gone up a little bit in the criteria. For example, on lane width, under the PPM, our minimum lane widths were 12 or 11 feet. We now have a wider range of lane widths that we can work with. If you're in the C3 through C6 and you're looking at 25 to 35 miles an hour, we now start with 10-foot lanes and work our way up. So you don't have to go back and ask for a variation to go down to 10-foot lanes if you need to use one. Now, having said that, there are a lot of good reasons not to use a 10-foot lane. if you have a roadway that has a lot of transit on it, if you have a roadway that you know is a major truck route, lots of good reasons that you wouldn't want to use a 10-foot lane, but there's also a lot of good reasons that you would want to use a 10-foot lane. So if none of the other conditions apply, especially in our most urban conditions, C5 and C6, where everything is already built out, space is very tight, every foot comes at a premium, then we have the option of going with the 10-foot lanes here. You don't need a design variation. You can just go ahead, and that's actually in the standards for, or in the criteria for these lower speed conditions on these locations. Coming to the end of the presentation here, I want to talk a little about the training that we'll be offering. Once the handbook gets back in and we've got any comments from folks and made any changes that we need to make to it, we'll be offering training on the handbook. There will be regional workshops in September and October of this year, and those dates will be posted on our website. We've almost got them all nailed down. We had to change a few of them, so they're not there right now. But in September and October, we'll have one workshop in each district. It'll be a half-day workshop for any folks that want to come in and participate in that. And what we'll be talking about at those workshops are the context classification system, how the handbook is put together, and we'll also have the districts there with us. And so each district will have folks there to talk about what's going on specifically in their district. So if you have questions about specific projects that your MPO is working on or things that are important to your community, your district will be there to answer those questions for you and get you pointed in the right direction at those workshops. So those will be coming up in September and October. Please keep an eye on the website at flcompletestreets.com for that information. I'm sure we'll also be sending out our regular email blast and all the things that we do to let people know that we're putting these events together as well. And again, flcompletestreets.com will have the information that you may want to look for to keep up to date on that. Okay, that's the presentation that I have for you this morning, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have. I don't know what have come in, but I'm going to open it up for that, and be glad to answer any other questions that you may have.
I may have missed it when you were talking about the SIS, but with the design speeds, how is it being handled when the posted speed on an existing road is greater than the design speed for the new classification? Like you have a 45 or a 50 mile an hour roadway that goes through an urban center.
Yeah, keep in mind these are the criteria here are for new construction. So if you're building a road today, that's how we would want to have it work. On 3R projects where you may have that situation, and you know, we're on a 3R project, we're not going to tear up the whole road and change the curvature and things like that to get the design speeds in the area where they need to be. There are a few ways you could handle that. One way might be to say, you know, this was the existing design, and we'll have to deal with that on a future project whenever we get ready to reconstruct that roadway, and you just work with it in the way that it is there. Depending on the situation, that might not be too much of an issue. And keep in mind, for suburban, 50 is today is the actual the minimum design speed on the SIS. So that's really not going to be a difference under a complete streets approach. Also, even for urban general, we do have SIS roadways in urban areas that work at 45 or 40. So that's not, again, that would not be a big deal on the SIS. You do see these lower 35 and 30 mile an hour design speeds here. And what we found was that in these C5 and C6 areas, and it wasn't an exhaustive analysis, but they went through and looked at where these areas are and where they had SIS facilities in these areas. And what they found is that a lot of times they were already operating at these speeds. So the SIS folks did not see that as being a big hurdle for them to have those speeds in those places. In fact, all of these roadways, and I should have said this earlier, all of these speeds are currently applied today. I can drive today, I can take Highway 90 or Highway 20 out west of Tallahassee and drive out into District 3, and I'll see small towns where the speed is posted at 25, 30 miles an hour on a state facility, even though the PPM at one point told us you're supposed to be designing for 40 or higher. Our engineers over the years I think a lot of times have done their best to try to make the speeds match something that they thought was safe and appropriate. They just had to go through hurdles to make that happen. And what we're trying to do with the FDM is remove those hurdles. So you don't have to ask for permission to do the right thing. Just go ahead and start here and make it work. So we already have these speeds in places on the ground in a lot of places. And we don't know that there'll be that many places where we'll need to change it. Where we do need to change it, that will be a more complicated situation. So if you have say for instance, a road where maybe on-street parking was removed some years ago, and so the speed went up from say 25 or 30, maybe now it runs through there at 40 or 45 miles an hour, we may talk about, do we want to get that speed back down to what the speed is shown here. There are several ways to do that. Some are more complicated than others. You can change curb geometry, you can add bulb outs, you can do things with the signalization. Lots of things you can do to adjust those speeds, and on a 3R project, you will begin to see some of that coming into play. In the handbook, we have a section in there on techniques that can be used to manage the design speed and the operating speeds of roadways, and the department will be doing more work on that and coming up with more ideas on how exactly we do that. We're really good at building things fast. We're learning how to build things slow. So hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, having a higher design speed than your posted speed is okay, but you wouldn't want to be in a situation where you have a lower design speed and a higher posted speed, because then
that's exactly right.
That gets into a dangerous situation.
And we already have that situation today, and what we found is that our design criteria were really giving us faster speeds than we wanted to have. In particular, once you get above 45 miles an hour, it's really difficult to manage those speeds and get them back down. So, if you're looking at 12 or 11-foot lanes, you really have very little that you can work with to manage those speeds. And so we are already dealing with a situation where we design a road at 45 and come out 2 years later and do a speed test and discover people are driving it at 55 or 60. Well, now what do we do? Because, we don't want to have a speed limit that's artificially low, but we also don't want to have a road that we're telling people to drive on faster than it was designed for. That certainly is a safety issue.
Is enforcement involved at all in the process?
Sometimes quite a bit. Sometimes that's why we get called, because there's a perception that there's too much enforcement and they're writing too many tickets. But the law enforcement's job is to enforce the speed limit that some engineer said was on that roadway. So, they come to us and say, well, is that really the right speed for that road? And that's where we have these conversations about, well, what should our criteria be in order to get us to a lower design speed? As I said, we're really good at designing to make roads faster. We're learning more about how to design for a particular speed that we want to have on a roadway.
Turning radii. You mentioned a few of the things that are being changed with the difference in the speeds, but are turn radii also going to be affected with the lower design speeds?
Yeah, what we do there is we talk in the FDM, and I invite you, if you haven't looked at it yet, to go take a look at the FDM. That's open for comments up through July. In fact, they haven't even set in a specific time, but I encourage you all to go take a look at that and look at that more closely. We talk in the FDM about design vehicles and control vehicles. And your turning radii are going to be set by what your design vehicle and what your control vehicle are. And for the state road system, we're pretty much still going to stay with our WB62FL or whichever one that is for your design vehicle and for the state road system. But it will make a difference whether you're making a turn onto, say, a local street or making a turn onto another state road, and what that design criteria needs to be. So that's all in the FDM. Some of those will change based on the type of vehicle that you're using for your design speed. So, but again, we're trying to avoid one size fits all. And when you look at what your speed is, that will affect, what type of vehicle you're trying to work with, or I'm sorry, what kind of radius you're looking for.
You're so good that in answering that question, you answered the next one about control vehicle and design vehicle. Someone was saying if you can talk a little bit about the control vehicle and the design vehicle, if there's any changes, or it sounds like for the state highway system, it's remaining the same. Is it changing at all for the local roads?
Well, again, this is for the FDM-controlled state roads, and the Green Book Committee did vote at their last meeting to begin to change the Green Book to make it more context-based, and so you may see some of this making its way into the Green Book. The design vehicle, of course, is the vehicle that you expect to be there pretty much every day. So that's your largest vehicle that you expect to have come through that intersection on a daily basis. And so you want to make sure that vehicle can get through without having to do lane encroachment, without having to bump over a curb, without having to make somebody back up as they make a turn. So that's your design vehicle. The control vehicle is it's the largest vehicle you can anticipate ever really needing to get through that intersection. It's not something you expect to see that often. And it's okay if the control vehicle has to do some lane encroachment, if maybe we have to, somebody has to move themselves at an intersection a little bit to make that turn. That's okay for a control vehicle. So when we're doing our design, we want to be clear about which type of vehicle we're using for which. I will tell you that on local streets, a lot of times we would use an SU truck, that's like a FedEx truck or fire truck, for a design vehicle and say, okay, those kind of trucks should be able to come through with no trouble at all. But if you're a tractor trailer on a local street, we don't mind if you have to swing a little wide, and we don't mind if somebody maybe has to back up to let you through, because we don't expect to see a tractor trailer coming through this neighborhood street on a daily basis. That happens, a few times a year maybe when somebody moves in. So on a local street, that works pretty well. On a state road, they begin to look more alike, because state roads, we do anticipate that we have trucks there on a fairly regular basis. And so we recognize the concept in the FDM, but the distinction between those two types of vehicles, it's probably not going to be as dramatic as it would be, say, if you were designing for a local road system.
If you could bring up the 8 classification slide again.
Yeah.
There's a question about the difference between C2T and C4. Would a city with a population over 10,000 and an urbanized area with a grid roadway network and a mix of industries be considered C4?
That's a good question. The C4 category is your general urban fabric, and the C5 is the center of that area. So if you have an area, most urban areas do have some kind of a center to them in Florida, and whatever that is, that's your C5. Within the handbook itself, there's a matrix. Wait a second, I can actually bring that up for you. That will show you what how these things all actually play out. In fact, we're working on a presentation right now, a webinar that will go over how all these fit together, and we'll go over this context classification matrix and how to apply all these. But let me just pop down there to that real quick, and I can kind of show you what it looks like. Okay. And one of the things we say in the training is that this matrix I'm going to show you looks kind of scary because it's a table with like all these columns and rows on it. But when you actually use it for context classification, it's really not that big a deal. Let me zoom out. Okay. So do this with spread. Okay. So here's our context classification matrix, and zoom in a little bit. Okay, and so here's our context classifications on the side, and the way it works is here's your name of your context classification. These distinguishing characteristics are your first thing that will tell you what category you're in. So when you look at that, it's going to tell you pretty quickly what kind of an area you're looking at. If you want to be quite certain, the next step is to go and use these primary measures, which are in this blue box here. And these are just different categories of things you can use to try to distinguish between two measurements or two categories that, two classifications that may be close together. Am I in C4 or am I in C5? Am I in C4 or am I C3, C commercial? Which one of these am I in? You can use these categories here to help you figure out which of those actually apply to your condition. So using that will help you figure out which one of these categories you would be in, and what we find is that we've done this a number of times now, it's usually pretty quick to go in and sort through, largely based on block structure, and the transportation network are the big players in this that will tell you what context classification you're in. Those are the things that are hardest to change. Land use can change pretty quickly, almost overnight sometimes. Block structure and then transportation network structure are usually in place for a long time, and they're much harder to change. And they actually, a lot of times, can be more diagnostic about what a context classification actually is. I hope I answered that.
That's a dumb question about the naming of these. Were you involved at all in conversations of the numbering system?
The numbering system from 1 to 6, with 1 being least urban or more rural, and 6 being the most urban, that actually was a part of the original transect design that DPZ came up with a number of years ago. ITE did a document that some of you may have heard of called Designing Walkable Urban Thoroughfares. And in that, they used the term context zone instead of transect zone. And they also used a C1 through C6 designation in there. And so we mirrored that. We did talk quite a bit, actually, about whether we should keep that or change it. And our logic was that since this is a form-based system, why would we not use a language that thousands of planners and designers have already learned to use for this context classification system, you know, so that 1 is least urban and 6 is most urban? Why would we want to change that at this point? And so we tried to mirror that, in fact, as closely as we could, but at the same time make it clear as we could that there are some distinctions between this. So in general, the nomenclature that you see here is very close to what you would find if you opened up any town that was based on the SMART code or any kind of form-based code. You would see something similar to this. And if your town has something similar to this, in the handbook, there's actually a table that will let you translate between what the context classifications are and what the similar transect would be.
That helps to know the background on that, because my first reaction when I saw it was, you know, I found it unusual that all the rurals are C2s, all the suburbans are C3s, and then the urbans change numbers without letter designations in between them. I was like, why not keep it consistent? But so I mean, there's a reason behind the madness, so that's good to know.
Well, there is, and we debated whether to turn that C3C and C3R, whether they should be one category or not. And I'll tell you, in our design criteria on the state system, they're almost identical. And same thing for C1 and C2. The criteria are very similar. So those distinctions are really more for planning than they are for design criteria. So planners also will need to use this, and so those are really there for those reasons.
Question about does right-of-way or roadway design play into context for future identification of design speed for current design projects? Well,
we wouldn't start by saying, you know, our right-of-way is this, therefore our design speed must be that. We actually would work the other way. We would start by looking at, say, well, what is my context of this area? And based on that context classification, what should my design speed be? And then we go and say, well, okay, my design speed says I should be this. And it also, you know, when I look at the handbook, it tells me I need to provide, I'm in a more urban condition, let's say, so I need to provide for cyclists and pedestrians and transit and a whole bunch of stuff I got to shoehorn in here. How am I going to do all this? Now I look at my right-of-way and say, wow, I don't have any. So I don't have any room for this. Now I have to make trade-offs and decisions about how exactly I'm going to balance the needs of these different types of users and get these things in here. That's why we're having the flexibility, for instance, to use a narrower travel lane. So maybe I can have a little wider sidewalk or a wider bike lane, you know, squeeze more elements in there. That's where having that flexibility in those higher context classifications really comes in handy. So that's sort of the relationship with that. We want to start with a context class and work backwards from there. We don't want to start by saying, well, this is how much space we have, what can we do with it, until we know what needs to be done with it. Other questions?
There are no other questions in the chat. We'll give folks a minute here to see if, as they digest all of this information, they come up with something else. It's been a very good discussion.
Yeah, I appreciate the questions. I know this is some of it is more familiar to some folks than others, and as people get into it, we're hoping they will let us know what questions they have. To be honest, we haven't met with a whole lot of pushback on it. What's that?
I was going to say that the January 2018 one becomes effective, so that it's basically any projects that are starting beyond that date.
Yes, actually, let me go back to that slide so I tell you exactly what the language is. Well, where'd it go? Here it is. Yes, in January 18, it becomes effective. So projects that have not yet begun design by that time will need to use this criteria. And projects that, if you're already in place, you use the stuff that you've been using. So this is really no different than when we post a new PPM for years. We always post a new PPM in January, and there's language in there that says, okay, here's when this PPM becomes effective, and it's very similar to that kind of language. We just wanted to make sure we weren't forcing people to make a bunch of changes and plans that were already underway, but we want people to start using this as quickly as they reasonably can. If you're scoping projects now, people will be scoping projects now that will be going out next spring, and so we're trying to get them to use these criteria to scope those projects now.
And then again, if people want to find out more information, you've done webinars, and do you have recordings up on your site of presentations and webinars and more information if people want to find out?
On the website itself, I have a brief webinar that has some of these slides in it, not as many of them, but this is actually a little video, a little 2-minute video, PowerPoint video that you can launch that will have some of those slides in it. As I do more webinars and more training, we'll have that information posted to the website as well. Right now, I'm trying to get a context classification video done that explains how to do context classification using that matrix and what all those different things mean. And so that will go on there as well. Eventually, I'd like to put this webinar that we're recording right now on there as well. And what's going to be helpful to me is getting questions back from folks about things that are not clear to them, so that we know, kind of where to point our training and where to structure it. For instance, we got a very thorough review from one of the regional planning councils last week, and turned out they didn't really seem to know that the FDM was out there, and that actually would have answered some of the questions that they had in their presentation, and so, or in their report to us. So, that let us know we probably need to adjust the handbook a little bit to make it more clear that you need to go to the FDM to get some of this information. So any kinds of questions people have actually help us figure out what we need to do a better job educating people on.
There's one more question in the chat about clarification on what roads this is used for. So FDOT uses funds on some off-system work. Should the FDM be used on these projects?
If it's a project that you would use the PPM today, then in the future you would use the FDM, because there won't be a PPM for you to use. So you'll have to use the FDM. That means you're going to have to look at context classification in those situations. So anything that would be done under the PPM today, you would use the FDM for in the future, and that means you're going to have to know the context classification of it. So yeah, if you're doing a local agency program or something like that, some of those use PPM criteria, then you would need to be familiar with this to do that.
Perfect.
And we did a presentation on some more material here to the LAP coordinators a few weeks ago, so they know this is coming as well, and hopefully are ready for this to come down.
And exciting changes. Good stuff.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, thank you again for letting me present and share this information with you. And please let me know if you have any questions. My contact information is here on the PowerPoint. And actually, it's not. I will add my contact information to the PowerPoint before I send you the final. You want to post it?
Sure. Yeah.
So,
make that change and send it over to me. I'll post that later this afternoon.
okay.
Right. This is Dennis Falloon. I just wanted to let you know, thank you so much. It was a good presentation, and I think they have the ability now to go to various sites on your webpage, and they'll have also our information on the webinar and the recording. So they should be able to acquire more information if they need it. So that'd be good.
Yeah, that's true. my information is right here on this website. So that's really the best way to get to flcompletestreets.com. That's easier to remember than my email address, and that will get you to me.
Good. I guess with that, there's no other questions coming in the chat. Thanks everyone for attending. I'll end the recording, and we'll stay on the line if anybody else has any other questions or somebody wants to chime in. Thanks you, everybody. Thanks, Dwayne.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'll stay on the line too.